Okay, Tom, you're on.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I hope you've got your cup of coffee or your glass of orange juice ready. Here we go.
I'm recording this. Is it working? Okay. I never won a wire before, but my counsel has advised me to make this statement. Yeah, I just want everyone to know that this is a true story, regardless of what you hear. So it all started one day when I was mowing the lawn, minding my own business. My name is Francesca Losavio. Come from a long line of Losavios, but my friends, they call me Frankie. I was new to the neighborhood because I move around a lot. My present employers move me around a lot, but I mind my own business. So one day, I'm mowing the grass and I notice this guy. He's my neighbor, and he's digging a hole in the front yard. So I want nothing to do with it. But this guy, my neighbor, I think his name is Tom, he starts toward me and he says he wants to talk. It's the rock, he says. What rock? I says. The rock in the hole, he says. I hit a rock, he says. I don't think it belongs there. So what? I'm thinking, this ain't my problem. I didn't put it there. I had nothing to do with it. I have never seen that rock in my life. Honest. And I told him that. But he shows me the rock anyways. And it's one big rock. Probably from Canada, he says. Piece of granite. What, did this guy fall out of a tree, I'm thinking? I knew some Canadians through my former place of employment, and they didn't do nothing like this. But this guy Tom, he wouldn't stop. He keeps asking, like the rock was important or something. Imagine that, a rock. So I'm starting to feel conspicuous, standing there next to this big hole while all these cars drive by. And these people are looking at me, lots of people. I am not comfortable. So I says to Tom, I know this guy. Through my former place of employment, Dr. Smith. That's it, Dr. Smith. He works at like a fancy university. But we became acquainted while I was working with my former employer. It turns out Doctor had a bit of a gambling habit. Recreational pastime, you might say. And I would visit him periodically to help him with his, well, cash flow problems. I was always trying to help. I'm always trying to help people. I says to the guy next door, Tom, I'll ask the doctor. So that's how it started, the story of the rock. So you listen to this guy, Tom, I think that's his name. At least that's the name he gave me. So honest, this is a true story, regardless of what you hear. But I'm sorry, I gotta go now. I mean, my present employers would wish to speak with me at this moment. So I gotta go.
So if that didn't scare you away, ask a simple question: what if there had never been an ice age?
There would have been no pebbly bottom prairie streams flowing in broad, outwashed valleys. And no gravelly glacial cames rising 100 feet above that valley. There would have been no prairie potholes like the restored Turtle Marsh. There would have been no bur oaks growing on the steep, gravelly sides of Kettles. There would have been no bur oaks growing on gravelly ridges. No steep ice contact slopes. Oh my goodness, this is steep. There would be no fens full of skunk cabbage because there would be no porous glacial aquifers through which the groundwater could move.
Today I do want to focus on the background. I think it's a background a lot of naturalists don't see. Like all of you probably, I began by focusing on something. It was wildflowers, and then it was trees, and one thing and another over the years. But I want to look at the background now, what organizes and gives a place for all those things to happen. So we'll be looking at the plain here, and not just the antelope on the plain. We'll be looking at the moraine. This is the Marengo Moraine in the western part of McHenry County where I work. If I had shown you this picture and asked you what it was, you probably would have said a forest, or you might have said white oak trees, but you probably wouldn't have said a moraine because that's in the background. That's the basis on which everything else occurs, but it's not what immediately appears in most people's eyes. And this is where that transition from seeing bits and pieces of nature to seeing the larger patterns that underlie the organization of those little bits happened for me. This is the 1980s, and this is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about a mile from Lake Superior in the Huron Mountains, where I worked from 87, 88, and 89. And I was tasked by my advisor, Dr. Barnes, to map ecosystems in this place. And I knew I'd used the word ecosystem before. I'd taken a lot of ecology classes, but he was using it in a particular way I wasn't familiar with. He was talking about real places. And I learned pretty quickly that I'd never seen one before. I had seen the trees, and I'd seen the rocks, and I'd seen the little pockets of soil, the white pines, the red pines, the scrubby red oaks, the ground flora. I'd seen all of those things and had become quite accomplished at recognizing and recording on data forms, but I'd never seen the place before. And that transition from seeing the bits and pieces to the place and understanding the larger organization of the landscape around the pattern of geologic forms was something that probably took a month to 6 weeks that first summer up there, very frustrating months to 6 weeks. And as soon as I made that transition, it changed everything for me. And today, too many years later, so what would that be, 32 years later, the world appears to me very differently than it did before this moment. So we can look at glacial landforms, and it's important to see the landforms because it really controls all these things like water movement, wind movement, fire movement, sun exposure, and soil nutrient levels in the parent material. All of these are these pervasive influences on the living things that occur above and inside the root systems of plants. All of this is organized at that larger scale by the geologic forms. This is a very simple example from the Morton Arboretum where I worked in the early 90s. There's a little glacial came, a little gravel hill on the glacial moraine. And so where it says moraine, if you put a soil auger in the ground, you would find really heavy clay soil, which weathers to an acid profile over the last 14,000 years. And that's a perfect place for white oaks. The gravelly came is a very, obviously very gravelly soil. And we have a soil that's made up of calcium carbonate gravel. It really doesn't weather to an acid profile. And so bur oaks dominate there. And you can step back and forth. It's about 2 or 3 steps from one to the other. And the tree community changes completely across that boundary. Again, it's just a sort of small scale example of how geologic forms structure the living world. Volo Bog, and right on the boundary between Lake and McHenry County. Started off as a glacial kettle hole and is now a beautiful bog with tamarack trees. Just on the left, glacial cames, gravelly hills can, depending on their exposure to wind and fire over the millennia, they can be gravelly bur oak savannas, as they are typically in Glacial Park, but there are other places in the county like the Cary Junior High School Prairie, where they host a beautiful gravel hill prairie. And glacial outwash, you can produce savannas near the West Branch of the DuPage River in West Chicago, at the West Chicago Prairie. Have a beautiful bur oak savanna there, and in southwestern McHenry County, we have the Hum Prairie, just railroad remnants of the former prairies across the outwash plains. You can see the broad flatness of this landform, which not coincidentally transmits fire very easily. So one fire covers a huge area in an outwash plain, and so a tendency for those broad outwash areas to be prairies in a pre-European settlement landscape. So today we're going to be walking behind the glacier, and it's really about, to me, it's a holistic thing. Geology, as an ecologist and still an ecologist, geology became a way of telling the story of land and extending that story farther back in time to see those larger causes of the patterns in nature. And to do that, to tell a story, we need a concept of time. And this is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to the development of geology as a science. Through the Enlightenment, or very early on, there was a fellow named Nicholas Steno, an Italian monk, who came up with this law of superposition. And it seems so simple, it would require no, you'd think a child would know this, and yet this was the first time anyone stated it. And he said in a stack of sediments, like this stack of newspapers and a floor of the Chicago region and my iPad and my field book, that the oldest has to be on the bottom, and as you go up, they get younger. And that seems so perfectly common sense that wouldn't need to be said, but you have to see, looking at this box, the wooden box with these things on it, you think, well, that's obvious. The paper was there when I sat down on the floor on which I put the iPad, and then the field book. But this is a stack of sediments that can be tens or hundreds of feet thick. And you tell someone the oldest is on the bottom and the next one up is younger, you have to see something in that no one had seen before. And that is that stack of sediments happened in time, one after the other after the other. That it wasn't all created at one point in time, rather it happened in a sequence of moments in geologic history. And by the early 19th century, this idea of superposition, the Steno's law, was well established, but a fellow named Smith, not the same Smith that Miss Francesca was referring to, this is William Smith, in the early 19th century, was a canal digger and then did some agricultural land drainage, but ended up digging a lot of trenches and holes in the ground, and he began to notice the similarity in fossil assemblages between various places in England. And he came up with this idea that a similar fossil assemblage meant it was a similar age. And so it didn't matter whether it was shale in one place where you hit that fossil assemblage or limestone in another. If they had the same fossils, they were the same age. And this was absolutely key to developing, for geologists to develop this idea of relative time, but to start to put together the story of geological ages. So we have these geological periods, the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Pennsylvanian. Each one of them has a characteristic group of fossils. And so wherever you find them, anywhere in the world, regardless of what kind of rock you're looking at, if you can see enough fossils, you can date the rock, relatively speaking, to the Cambrian, without knowing how long ago the Cambrian was. Before the Cambrian, which is, we now know, is around ballpark 600 million years, this boundary, the Precambrian was another eon of really the era, at least early geologists thought before there was any life. We now know that microscopic life existed long before that boundary. But the origin of large organisms that leave remnants and fossils that we can see with the naked eye was that boundary between the Precambrian and the Cambrian. So this idea of superposition and fossil correlation gives us, we can start to describe these geologic periods. But to do that, we need a set of rules. Every story needs rules. If you're watching a detective story on television, you don't expect that in one scene the person didn't have the gun, but in the next scene, which is supposedly the same scene, he does have a gun. That's breaking the rules. There have to be rules to a story, the sort of continuity of rules. And in geology, they call that uniformitarianism, which sounds like a religion, but it's a way of thinking about the past. See, we can't go back 300 million years into the past, but we have to assume that gravity worked the same. We have to assume that there was ice on the earth and that ice had the same properties that ice we look at today, that magma that comes out of the earth as lava would have behaved the same then as it does today. We had to have that uniformity of process over time in order to make any of these interpretations. And so the first thing geologists did was to just look at the thickness of sediments and try to get an estimate of the rate at which sediments were accumulating today. And from that, look back at those huge stacks of rocks that could be many hundreds of feet thick. And what they discovered was that the Earth was really old. I mean, their initial estimates of tens of millions of years, even millions of years. We now know the Earth is at least 4.5 billion years old, but in a world where thousands represented a huge expanse of time, almost beyond human imagination, even the mention of millions, much less tens or hundreds of millions, was mind-boggling. It was shocking. It was frightening, that expansion of a timescale, which seemed to push human beings into a relatively small part of the history of the universe. So, according to uniformitarianism, when we look at a big stack of sand like this, a big sandstone cliff, and it looks like beach sand turned into rocks, and we occasionally find fossils of organisms that look somewhat like organisms living in beaches today, that had to be an ocean sediment, even if it's on top of a mountain today. I mean, this is pretty revolutionary thinking. We've become so used to this today since grade school. We all hear these stories and ideas of glaciers and mountains eroding down to the sea and rising up again. But in the early 19th century, this was shocking, a shocking new worldview. And so when we look at evidence we now think of as evidence of glaciers, like these grooves and striations in bedrock, they demand an explanation, and we can't use a miraculous explanation. We can't infer any cause that we can't see operating today. And so this was a great puzzle to naturalists and people who would later be called geologists. Likewise, a pile of sediments like this, which seems to be so commonplace, and it looks so obviously to be deposited by water. If you look at this little Swiss Army knife, right under that is a layer that's sort of coarse sands and pebbles. Occasional larger rock in it. Right above that is a coarser level. Right below it is a coarser level. That sort of interbedding of coarse and finer materials, each one of those beds relatively well sorted, is characteristic of water deposited materials, which makes perfect sense if you find it next to a river. But when you find it in a hill that's 100 feet above the surrounding landscape, it doesn't make any sense at all, because we don't see anywhere on the earth today where water is making hills 100 feet high. Again, a great puzzle to natural historians of that day. And this stuff, which is really the most common stuff under your feet when you walk around the Chicago area, this is glacial till, and we don't often see it like this because anywhere within about 5 or 6 feet of the surface, it's very weathered. It turns yellow and orange. If you dig into it in your backyard, you probably call it clay. usually preceded by a few bad words. If you're trying to dig it when it's dry and it's hard like a brick, or you're dealing with it when it's wet and sticky and muddy, it's not very forgiving material, but to a geologist, it's a great puzzle. Now in England, before glacial theory in the very late 18th, early 19th century, this was called Boulder Clay because it's a nice descriptive word, because in these deposits you could find anything from boulders that could be a few feet to 10 feet in diameter, and clay particles, which are thousandths of a millimeter in diameter, all mixed into the same material, not sorted at all. It's very difficult to look on the earth today and see anywhere where a process, except with glaciers, anywhere where there are any naturally occurring processes that create some odd sediment like this that has clay particles and large rocks all mushed together into the same sediment. Yet it's common. It extends over hundreds, thousands of square miles in the Midwest. And so this is what Francesca was talking about, the boulders belonging somewhere else. Again, this was not, I mean, people in the early 19th, 18th, 17th century, you can go back 200,000 years. People are just as smart as we are today. They were just using a different knowledge base and a different style of thinking, and saw the boundaries between material and spiritual differently. But they were coming up with what to them were common sense explanations for how the world operated and how to account for these strange things. And this is a strange thing because this boulder, if you look at its mineralogy, doesn't belong where you find it. It doesn't belong to the bedrock. How do a rock that, I have no idea what this would weigh, probably 1,000 or more pounds. How would a rock like this get here from southern Canada? Does that make any sense? I mean, did enough Native Americans all get together at once and carry this? It doesn't make any sense at all. How did it get here? Well, they had a word for it then. It's the same word we use now, and it's called an erratic, and it's erratic in its distribution. It doesn't seem to obey the common sense that it should belong to the local bedrock, but it doesn't. And so geologists had this collection of these early geological thinkers, let's say, had this collection of odd things that they couldn't or didn't have a really good explanation for. These gravelly sediments, sometimes piled up in tall hills, again in landforms that don't seem to be made by water today. These striated stones, these large rocks that are out of place. And something we'll talk about a little bit later. This is Glacial Park where I work in the Nippersink Creek. And this is the valley, which can be up to a half a mile wide, and yet it's occupied by a very tiny little stream. Well, did that tiny little stream actually make that large valley? These were all puzzles. And initially, geologists had a common sense explanation for many of these phenomena. How do these boulders from Canada get, or some sort of igneous rock, get to Chicago area, which has a sedimentary rock basis, a dolomite? Well, if you consider the Great Flood as a part of, a sort of factual part of Earth history, you combine that with sailors in the North Atlantic who were seeing icebergs, which we now know are breaking off of glaciers coming off of Greenland. And those icebergs are floating out in the sea, and as they melt, they're dumping rocks and mud into the ocean, and you see that, and you record that, and you report it back. You combine those two things, and it becomes obvious where the boulders came from. The boulders full of rock or the icebergs full of rock and mud and boulders were floating on the Great Flood and just dropped this stuff out as they melted. So that's how the rocks got. It's a common sense explanation, given the factual, if you include Noah's flood, the Great Flood, as a part of Earth history. But by the early 19th century, we began to question that spiritual interpretation of time, and we came up with glacial theory. And glacial theory really comes from an odd place. It comes from peasants living in the Alps who unlike the great minds of the Geological Society of London, by the 19th century or the late 18th, early 19th century, they are well aware that glaciers have been much farther downslope in the Alps than they were at that present time, and that some of the landforms the glaciers left behind were in fact glacial landforms. But this was an idea that was not very well understood by the geologists of the day. As it worked its way into the scientific establishment, this glacial theory, it probably took 2 or 3 decades to really gain complete acceptance. It was probably the 1830s or 40s before it became what we now think of as a fact of history, from what was initially a sort of crackpot speculation. And the reason we accept it today is not because of any one line evidence, because it brings together all of these different phenomena together in the same explanation. I didn't explain lake level changes. Those are, if you follow some of the glacial lake levels of Lake Michigan, the Nipissing level, for instance, which was about 20 feet above the current level and was occupied by a lake about, let's say roughly 6,000 years ago, and you follow that shoreline northward, it gets higher and higher in elevation. It starts off 20 feet above the lake and it ends up 100 feet or so above the lake by the time you get to the northern part of Lake Michigan, which is of course impossible. No lake the surface of a lake can't be on a slope, can it? And yet we see that, and we now know that's a part of glacial theory because the weight of the glacier was so much that it crushed the earth downward. And so when that lake level and the beach was formed, the land was at a lower elevation. It has since rebounded, called isostatic rebound, so the shoreline has increased in elevation in the northern parts of the Michigan Basin, whereas it stayed about the same in the southern part of the basin. So all of these strange phenomena that you could come up with an explanation, maybe a far-fetched one for any one of them, but glacial theory united all of them into one theory, and that's one of the hallmarks of a good theory, is it pulls together a lot of problems and solves them in one fell swoop. And so this idea of glaciers, which was not, I mean, people knew about glaciers in the early 19th century, but like this mountain glacier here. But the idea that this is a mountain glacier, so it's a pretty big object, that ice has to be more than about 100 meters thick to flow. And so this is obviously flowing through this gap in the rocks and spreading out like a big bunch of mud. It doesn't behave anything like ice in your drink. You know, those little hard, brittle cubes of ice, when you pile ice up really deep, it starts to move, starts to deform in a sort of plastic flow. But the idea that glaciers once could have covered most of the British Isles and much of Northern Europe and much of the northern part of North America was a crazy idea. And that's why it took decades for the scientific establishment to accept it and come up with what we now think of as glacial theory. I'm going to digress here just for a moment and talk a little bit about rocks, because whenever I do a geology presentation and we go outside, people are always looking at the stones and asking where these stones come from. But before I go any farther, does anyone have any questions? You got any questions yet, Jackie?
There's no questions in the chat, but if you guys have a question, you can unmute yourself and say it.
Okay. Well, I like to start that introduction to geology, because for me, geology is about creating a story of land, but geology itself is a part of the story, and it's a story of the expansion of the worldview of at first European peoples and then others that radically changed our place in the universe and radically changed how we looked at the world and our place in the world. I think it was really quite so shocking. I'm not sure we're even quite used to it today, 200 years later. So we'll look at some rocks here. Now we're sort of reducing the scale to the commonplace, where we can look at things we can pick up in our hands.
Gravels like this seem to me the most common of things. Many of us have looked at piles of gravel like this for much of our lives every now and then. But if you look closely, the gravels of the Midwest and glacial country are unlike the gravels you would find anywhere else in the world, because they're not just one rock, they're not just the local bedrock. There are many, many different kinds of rock that come from many places. So here we have a piece of granite from somewhere up on the Canadian Shield. Here's a piece of Baraboo quartzite that comes from a few hundred miles north of us. Here's a piece of chert. This is a part of the dolomite bedrock of the region, but sort of a silica, crystalline silica rock, and you can see how it breaks like a piece of glass with these sharp edges. Native Americans formerly made arrow points out of this rock because it breaks on a very sharp edge. This blonde-colored rock, the white rock, is the dolomite, the bedrock of the region, so it makes up most of the rocks that you find. But the dolomite is of Silurian age, about 400 million years ago, and this was formerly a coral reef in a tropical sea, and you can see here a coral fossil. And here is a fossil of a crinoid, a filter-feeding animal that lived among those coral reefs. So that's the neat thing about gravels here in the Midwest. They just make up so many different kinds of rocks from so many different places.
So when we look at rocks, we typically divide them into three basic types. And these are, probably you went through this somewhere in school, but I'll just review it quickly. Igneous rocks are rocks that form as molten magma below the earth solidifies, or it becomes lava when it's excreted by a volcano, solidifies at the surface. Those are igneous rocks. Sedimentary rocks are sediments typically that accumulate in a body of water. I mean, most sedimentary rocks are ocean sediments, but we do have sedimentary rocks that are the result of old river deposits. We also have sedimentary rocks that are chemical sediments that precipitate out in a body of water. Much limestone is of that sort, with little calcium carbonate crystals in a supersaturated situation, crystallizing out and forming layers of rock in a similar way that the chert that I showed you just a moment ago is called a cryptocrystalline rock made up of tiny little silica crystals that crystallize out of solution in an ocean, in a wet environment. And so we can look here at igneous rocks and look at two important sort of directions at which we can differentiate igneous rocks. Now rocks are not like species of trees. And so, and it's as if, like when you look at soils, they vary continuously across the landscape, and there's continuous variation in rocks depending on the environment of their formation and the chemistry, in the case of igneous rocks, of the magma from which they were formed. So there's no distinct boundary, and there's granite on one side and gabbro on the other. Rather, granite is a magma that's richer in silica and quartz, and gabbro is richer in iron and magnesium, comes from a magma richer in iron and magnesium, which then forms minerals like olivine and amphibole. So basalt similarly is a magnesium and iron rich rock or magma that here solidifies, the granite and gabbro solidify under the earth. They solidify slowly, and when rock magma solidifies slowly, the crystals can grow to large sizes, and these typically are sand-sized, coarse sand-sized crystals. You can see them with the naked eye. It gives granite that really pretty, when it's cut and polished, a really pretty texture. If it cools even more slowly, like this rock on the left, the crystals grow enormous, up to the size of my thumb, and we call that a pegmatite. If the magma that's excreted at the surface is lava and is flowing and then solidifies at the surface, it solidifies much faster, and the crystals are very tiny, often below the size class at which you can actually see them with the naked eye. And we get basalt, which is a common rock, erratic in our area, and pebbles, just dark gray rock, or rhyolite if it has it's richer in silica. If the magma is blown out out into the air and crystallizes almost instantaneously. We get a glass, volcanic glass, which has no crystalline structure at all. And glass, like the window glass in your house, is actually a liquid because it has no crystalline structure and it actually flows. It just flows very slowly. They can measure glass in old houses made back in the 19th century, and it's in fact thicker on the bottom than it is on the top because glass very slowly flows because the molecules are not locked into a rigid crystalline structure. If that volcanic, stuff that's ejected from the volcano is full of air bubbles, we create a pumice, which is very lightweight rock and floats. And I have to tell this is a story on myself, my young self. When I was 12 years old, I was walking along a stream in Tennessee where I lived, and my usual one, I was turning over rocks, picking up rocks and throwing them in the water like any little boy would do. And I picked up this rock that was really light in weight and I heaved it into the water and it floated. And I already knew enough. I must have had my little golden book of geology that I looked in and saw there was a rock that floated and it was called pumice. And when I saw that rock float, I immediately thought to myself, oh, it's a piece of pumice, which it couldn't be because that was Tennessee was below the glacial margin and it was all Cretaceous age limestone, but I didn't know that. I just knew there was a rock floating. So I chased this rock down the stream for, I don't know, at least 10 minutes, running down the stream and trying to get out in the stream. And the rock goes by and I keep running and running down the stream and finally go out in the middle of the stream, waist deep. The stream is a little high. And I reach out and grab this rock, risking life and limb. And I keep this rock until I'm in my late 20s as a part of my rock collection. My mother would throw rocks away every time we moved, but I protected this rock because it was a particularly interesting, valuable rock to me. And then I'm taking my first earth science class and I walk up and it comes a day when I just have to show my rock collection. And I bring this rock up to the front and show the teacher, and he takes one look at it and he says, oh, that's an industrial cinder. And I still have the rock, but now I know it was not a piece of pumice. So context is everything in geology. Sedimentary rocks. We have a similar idea of grain size in sedimentary rocks. Here it means something slightly different. When we have a gravel that is cemented together, and these particles are generally cemented together by calcium carbonate, lime, as it crystallizes out and glues things together. It could be cemented together by silica, similar to chert formation. Sandstones, likewise, the sand grains are glued together by either calcium carbonate or silica, reduction in grain size. When geologists look at that today, you can say that this was a sort of beach formation because that's where we find sand today, not out in deep ocean basins, but near a shoreline where there's turbulence in the water. This is very turbulent water where you have a conglomerate. If you go to Devil's Lake State Park and know right where to look, Devil's Lake, that Baraboo quartzite was once rising above sea level there, and you can actually see where the waves were breaking against the quartzite and depositing these cobbles, quartzite cobbles, that then became conglomerate formations that are now frozen in time as conglomerate, stuck right against the sides of the quartzite of Devil's Lake State Park. So
Yeah,
sandstone,
we had a
and
question.
when we look at shales and mudstones, now we're out probably in a quiet water basin in the ocean where there's very little current and the finest particles are settling out. Where this material is very obviously bedded and breaks apart in the air. Okay, go ahead.
So we had a question, are the crystals in the rock silica? Or maybe are there crystals in the rock silica?
Well, that's a good question because in a sandstone, I mean, most sand on Earth is quartz. It's quartz sand. Quartz, if you grind quartz down to a silt size, which is like 0.05 of a millimeter, like a grain of flour, it dissolves pretty quickly. but by the time it gets to sand size, it's almost impervious. It can last for literally billions of years as a sand-sized particle. So almost all the quartz, almost all the sand is quartz. And here, so this quartz sand is then glued together, and it could be glued together either by silica that's in solution in the water that then precipitates out, gluing the grains together, or it could be glued together by calcium carbonate. And you can usually tell the difference if you have a little acid bottle and you put a little acid on there. If it's calcium carbonate gluing the sands together, you'll get a fizz. And if it's not there, then it must be silica and you won't get a fizzy reaction. Similar with conglomerates, you can test to see what the gluing agent is. I mean, in a conglomerate, these pebbles could be just about anything. Whatever was being thrown around by the water and tumbled together and created that gravel formation. And whatever that gravel was then subsequently is glued together. And if it's a very lime-rich or calcium carbonate-rich environment, then it will be calcium carbonate that glues things together. All right. So the mudstone is essentially equivalent to shale, but it's a massive rock that's not, doesn't have that close bedding. On the right-hand side, the limestones are sort of a cross between what's particulate sediment that accumulates, because when you look at actual dolomites and limestones, you find out a good part of them is mud or sand or anything else that was accumulating in the ocean basin. But so much of the rock is made up of the calcium carbonate, or in the case of dolomite, a calcium magnesium carbonate, that we give it a different name. We call it limestone or dolomite. And that calcium carbonate is precipitating out of the water, so it's a chemical precipitate. So you can form, there were limestones being formed on Earth long before there were any shelled organisms on the Earth, but many limestones today, or for that matter, the dolomites of the Chicago region, are made up largely of the shells of organisms living in those ancient coral reefs. Within those same formations, you have silica in the water that precipitates out and forms chert, often in nodules, just sort of irregularly rounded forms in the body of dolomite or limestone, or it can form layers, either one. And remember, the chert is very hard. So when you grind this stuff up if a glacier grinds up this dolomite with chert in it, what happens is that most of the dolomite is pulverized because it's much softer than the chert. And it goes into solution. And so you don't often find rocks or dolomite in a glacial till. Some, but it's not nearly as common as chert fragments, which are far less common in the parent rock, but chert is almost impervious to weathering. And so it's left behind as one of the most common things we find in the glacial tills of the Chicago region. And if you start, as I've done an awful lot of soil work over the years, you pull a piece of chert out from 2 or 3 feet below the surface, it will still have a broken edge on it, looking like it was shattered just yesterday, but it was shattered anywhere from 14 to 20,000 years ago by a glacier. Metamorphic rocks are a third class of rocks, and these are rocks that change from one kind to another after they've already lithified, or lithified is a fancy word meaning it became a rock. So granite lithifies from molten rock, as does a basalt, but if you put it under intense heat and pressure deep below the Earth's surface, the minerals will rearrange themselves into this banded structure we call a gneiss. And the basalt will rearrange itself into a less obviously, because basalt, just because of the size of the mineral crystals, it's not as easy to see, into this banded structure called an andesite. Likewise, a sedimentary rock can be buried deeply. It can be we now know that, the surface of the Earth is dynamic and whole continental plates are moving, and the continental plates can be subducted and moved down below other plates. And so sedimentary rocks that were formed at the surface can be pushed downward and heated up and changed to other kinds of rocks. And a piece of sandstone, which typically sandstone is not that hard, you can generally break it pretty easy, if not with your hands, with a hammer pretty easily. Quartzite, however, is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. This is it's another microcrystalline quartz rock like chert, but this one is incredibly hard. It has a luster It breaks on a conchoidal fracture, much like chert on sharp edges. Limestone, on the other hand, limestone and dolomite, when you put it under great heat and pressure, it turns into marble, which is good because all of those wonderful sculptures that come out of the classical period, marble polishes to that beautiful, smooth, shiny surface. And it's relatively soft. If you tried to carve, if Michelangelo had tried to carve the statue of David out of a piece of quartzite, he would still be at it today. Now we're going to get back to our movie now and see where the story is going. Uh-oh, the feds. Good morning. Elliot Nest, Inspector, Bureau of Homeland Insecurity, Chicago Region. Last night at 2300 hours, our CD, Cyber Division, intercepted a communication between one Dr. John Smith and a person A concerning what we now suspect was part of an illegal international movement of uninspected materials. By 300 hours this morning, we had secured the contraband materials, the rock as it was referred to in the communications, and the premises on which it was located. Person A has repeatedly denied any role in the rock being in his front yard. Our investigation has now expanded to a person B, Francesco Lasavio, Frankie, former mob enforcer. Apparently, person B made the initial contact with Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith has stated that the rock was part of an extra-legal transport of materials he conservatively estimated at in excess of 17 billion tons. He said that ICE, presumably an acronym, had blanketed the Midwest with this material. If true, this would represent a dire threat to our national security. We have elevated the security situation. Land insecurity is working tirelessly to guarantee their health and safety. Because of the sensitive nature of this investigation, we cannot answer questions at this time. Thank you. Okay, time for an intermission. You got about 10 minutes to stretch your legs up, get a glass of water, whatever you need. We'll be back.
Great, so we'll say around 11 a.m. or so, we'll start up again. And Tom, I'm gonna mute you for the intermission. So if you guys gotta take a break or anything, you can. Otherwise, you can also ask Tom questions.
Yeah, certainly. You can ask any questions you want right now. I'm not going anywhere.
I just hit an unmute button. The unmute. I just see this. I got it down here. I hit the unmute button. Oh, did that work? I just hit it again. Let's see what happens. I don't know. Oh, that's where it would say Zoom.
Now, go ahead and ask them.
Well, I'm sorry we can't get it in, but I can get it on my hearing aids. That's it. Well, which is kind of bizarre.
right, it's 11 o'clock, so we'll pick up and get started again. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can always submit them in the chat box by going to the bottom of your screen. The taskbar is a chat button, or you can unmute yourself and jump in with your question. So, go for it.
Okay, my voice coming through, Jackie?
Yes.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to really deal purely with the Ice Age and with glacial movement and some of the mechanics of glacial movement, and then really with the local history, which will be different depending on where you live. I know we have people who will be viewing this or are viewing it who live other than in McHenry County, and the sort of local stuff will be in McHenry County, but the same rules apply. Remember uniformitarianism, those same rules apply in how you do interpretations, and the sorts of things that happen in McHenry County are like the sorts of things that happen in many other places. So we're going to start off with the question of how. This is a question that puzzled people from the early days of glacial theory, is that how on earth could glaciers, which seem to be at least relatively small features up in the mountains, how could they ever have covered large continents, or at least covered large areas of large continents? And if you really want the answer to that question, I would suggest this book, which I read many years ago. It was written about 1970 or so, but it's a wonderful story about the how people from starting in the 19th century up into the middle of the 20th century, how they were in trying to answer this very, very difficult question. But I'll just give you the sort of quick and dirty answer. And what people came up with was what's called an astronomical theory of the ice ages. Now, this isn't the only thing that's involved in why glaciers just happen to be large in Eurasia, or particularly in Europe and North America, but it's an important part of that explanation. So just give me a few minutes. What we know about how the Earth orbits around the sun, again, you ran through this in some sort of earth science or physical science class somewhere in your education, that the Earth follows an ellipse around the sun. But it turns out, and people have known, scientists have known this for a while, that ellipse isn't stable, that it becomes very elliptical and then goes back to almost circular and then out to elliptical again. And it moves back and forth between those two states on a frequency of about 100,000 years. We know that the Earth's axis is tilted at about 23 and a half degrees to the plane of rotation around the sun, but it turns out that 23 and a half degrees isn't stable. And that changes over time. And that changes on a frequency of around 40,000 years. And that's not enough. If you've ever, most of you are old enough, you probably don't spin tops anymore, but I remember being fascinated with spinning things and watching them spin a nickel, even if you can catch it just right, flick your finger and it will spin on the tabletop. And initially it seems almost stationary. The axis of rotation seems stationary, but then as it starts to slow down, it wobbles. And all tops, all gyroscope, whatever, will start to wobble. And that's called a precession around the axis. And so the Earth, it turns out, is wobbling. It's at 23 and a half degrees, but it's wobbling around that angle. And so that changes on about a 20,000 year cycle. And so we have these three different cycles. And each one of those is affecting the amount of solar radiation that the Earth receives in the northern hemisphere. And so this Serbian mathematician and geophysicist in the early 20th century actually worked this out with pencil and paper. This was before computers and calculators, but he actually worked out these for at least the more recent, work them back far enough that he speculated that these were in fact the causes of the Ice Age. And over time, this astronomical theory has gained increasing sway, and it's considered at least one of the principal causes of the Ice Age. Now we're going to look at the processes of ice movement and ice erosion and deposition, really, that creates the landscapes that we all love to walk on and study today. It's a nice graphic that shows that plastic flow atop of the glacier. It's only the bottom of the glacier that's under intense pressure that actually flows. The upper parts fracture because they're not under pressure, and that creates these crevasses that were famously skiers and explorers fall into, and then who was the famous late Ice Age hunter who fell in, who just got squeezed out of the glacier a few decades ago. So you become part of the ice load of the glacier. So we see that glaciers move just with gravity. There's a center of accumulation where the ice is piled up very deep, several miles deep. I mean, it's just a little beyond imagination that you could pile up ice several miles deep, but you pile it up that deep, and then it just starts to flow, and it flows outward just from gravity, just like pouring a bucket of wet mud. Gravity makes it spread out until the sort of the friction, inner particle friction within the mud and the friction with the floor or whatever you poured it on slows and stops it. The glacier, however, is continually fed by snow and ice and continues to push ice outward. So a glacier is a moving body of ice. It's a dynamic thing. It's not static. As soon as a glacier stops moving, it really stops being a glacier. It's just a big hunk of ice at that time. Glaciers are dynamic. They're moving, they're eroding, they're carrying sediment. And we see some of that erosion on the bottom. There's erosion at the bed, which is abrasion, just grinding things out. Now, glaciers can sometimes just slide over the surface. Sometimes they can erode it. They're quite variable in that way, but they certainly do a lot of erosion of the surface, and that material is then incorporated into the ice. And because the ice is a dynamic moving body of ice, that material can actually work its way up inside of the glacier. And the really large rocks, like those big boulders and erratics, actually find their way to the top of a glacier. There's no way they could stay at the bottom under all that pressure and grinding and remain, the size of small cars by the time they get there. So they get a ride and get up much higher in the ice sheet where they're not under such pressure anymore. And we can also see a phenomena called plucking, and we'll see that better in the next figure. This is an important way that glaciers erode bedrock. The glacial movement is in this direction from left to right. And you can see that there is abrasion on what they call the Stoss and Lee side, the Stoss side being the up glacier side where the ice is under incredible pressure grinding away at this rock. And on the other side, there's an almost complete lack of pressure, and the rock is simply plucked off. Big hunks of it are plucked off, which means that if you're looking at a landscape like this, in fact, I vacation often in southern Canada, in southern Ontario, north of Toronto, where there's metamorphic rocks that are bedded on this sort of angle, and the glacier is advancing across them at this angle. And you find that the slopes on one side are very gradual and then very sharp on the other side, and then very gradual again, then very sharp, because of the abrasion on one side and the plucking on the other. So locally, this can be an important way of looking at directions of glacial movement and how that glacial movement then shapes landscapes, because these, this slope will have a very different ecosystem pattern than will this rough, almost vertical slope on the lee side of the rock. Now we'll look a little bit at glacial deposition here. This is a sort of classic moraine formation. There are two ways that a glacier can deposit material. The ice itself can deposit material, and one of them is by smearing it on the ground under the glacier. So the glacier is both eroding, abrading, but also depositing things under the glacier. Really, glacial till can be very, very compact because it was deposited under the ice and squeezed under the tremendous weight of the ice. And it can also be deposited right at the edge where it's falling out as mud. Remember, the ice is always moving forward. When we talk about a glacial retreat, it doesn't mean the ice turns around and goes back to Canada where it's nice and cold. The ice can only move in one direction. Gravity only takes it in one way, and that's away from the center of accumulation. What happens is that this glacial front, during the winter, when it's below freezing, this glacial front is advancing, but in the summer, it then retreats. And the balance between those two determines whether the glacial front retreats over a period of years or advances. When it's advancing, it may be creating this morainal form around the front of the glacier, but then immediately just riding up over it, reincorporating into the ice and depositing it as a compact till or mud layer underneath. When it retreats, if it starts an overall retreat from this position, it will then leave a ridge of material behind. So we know, looking at this ridge of material, that marks where the glacier was sitting at one point in time, if we assume the same direction of glacial movement. When we get to this one, the glacier, so is this one older or is this one older is the question. We don't have the poll fixed up where I can get you to answer that question, but so this is one, this is another, this is another. This is sort of like Steno's law, only now interpreting glaciers. Which one is the older one? The one close to the glacier or the one far away? And if you thought about it for a while, you'd realize this has to be the older one, because had this been the older one and then the glacier advanced out to this, it would have obliterated this one. It wouldn't even be there. So it had to make this one first, retreat. You could have retreated out of this picture. We don't know where, and then re-advanced to this position, retreated, re-advanced to this position. Then glaciers are very dynamic. They don't just sit around in one place for very long periods of time. So that's just the basics of deposition of moraines. We're look at another peculiar form created by glaciers, and this is an erosional form called a tunnel valley. So this clear top cube here represents the ice, and then we have the bedrock down below. So this ice, if we're out, ice is always or frequently melting under a glacier, and the reason why ice can melt under a glacier even during the winter, and it's a phenomenon called pressure melting. Ice under pressure, the melting temperature actually goes down, which, if you stop to think about it, what it means is that ice even at lower temperatures will melt. It's the same phenomena that's used by ice skates. That's why ice skates work, is because of the pressure of those steel blades on the ice instantly melts the ice where the steel blade is against the ice, and that liquid water creates that almost frictionless glide of a skate on the ice. The same thing is happening under a glacier, only just the weight of your body. You have hundreds, thousands of feet of ice above that's pressing down, forming a liquid layer that allows the glacier to slide easily across the earth, occasionally abrading and eroding, certainly, and plucking. But so that there's water under a glacier, and that water eventually has to move, and it can move in channels. We can have channels on top of a glacier when it's summertime and the ice is melting on top. We can have channels inside of the body of ice, and we can have channels running under the ice. When that channel running under the ice is eroding the bedrock, we're going to call that valley created by the erosion a tunnel valley. And we'll see we have tunnel valleys in McHenry County. You'll see some real pictures of them here in a few minutes. This is a really very small example of tunnel valley formation, a tunnel in the ice, very small. When you can see a human figure here is relatively large. And we'll see tunnel valleys that are thousands of times larger than that. Here's the esker formation, similar sort of beginning point to an esker formation in a tunnel valley, only here you have the stream depositing. we're creating a depositional landform, and we'll call that an esker. The esker is really a stream sediment. The stream is flowing either under, on top of, or below the ice, and that stream sediment is then left behind as the ice melts. If it's all the way on top of a very thick ice sheet, probably it gets reorganized and moved, and it doesn't come to the surface in such a neat form. But if it's originally formed near the surface and then is lowered to the surface, we have this odd stream gravel, but now forming a ridge on the land. We have some tiny fragments of eskers in north central McHenry County. You really have to know your geology to be able to see them today. If you go into southern Wisconsin, they become a little bit more obvious. One of the problems with trying to show pictures of glacial landforms is they're fairly large. So in any one picture frame, you can't get rid of all the trees and buildings. You can't really see the form very well. All right, well, let's now look at a larger geologic scene and try to identify what we're looking at. So here is a mountain glacier. You see the rock mountain over here. Here is the glacier. Notice the glacier looks kind of dirty. Typical glacial front, it looks dirty because that's where the ice is melting. That's where all that material that was formerly being carried in the ice is now melting out and giving the glacier a very dirty look. Now we have a series of moraines here. 1, 2, a third one, maybe a fourth one there, then what may be one very large one or a collection of these smaller ones, and then a gap here. So we have moraines again, which is the older. It has to be the one the farthest from the glacier. That was formed first. Then there was another one formed. Again, the glacier could have gone back out of this picture and re-advanced to form this one, out of the picture again and re-advanced to form this one. We really don't have a record of how far it went back, but we do know that this one formed first, and then second, and then third, and then this would be the last either series of small moraines or one larger one. And you can see with the glacier melting, there's masses of water coming out of the glacier. And this isn't, you wouldn't want to stick a cup down and drink this water because it's full of sediment. It's full of clay and silt and sand and gravel. Depending on how fast it's going, it's carrying all of these sediments. So you'd have to let it settle for a while before you tried to drink it. And it breaks through the moraines, and it forms what we call the outwash plain here. The outwash plain is formed by braided streams, and you can get some sense of the braiding. Whenever streams are carrying really choked with sands and gravels, they'll coarse sediment, they will form this braided pattern. We can see that today in streams that have a bed sediment that's very sandy and gravelly. They'll tend to be broad and shallow and even form braided patterns today, but very common when you're near an active melting ice sheet. This forms a very flat plain, and we'll see some examples of those today and a little bit later. Here's one right now.
Broad, flat expanses like this are boring for most people and so characteristic of the Midwest. But they're really quite exciting places, because had you been standing here maybe 18,000 years ago, you would have been standing in ice-cold water running southward in the direction you're looking, choked with ice and sand and gravel issuing from a melting glacier immediately to our north.
You notice it was pretty windy out there. It's always windy in flat expanses, and that's, yeah, I mentioned it earlier, and trying to tie geology and ecology together, which are really two sides of the same coin for me. That wind is what carries fire, and fire moves so quickly across flat surfaces that most of those broad outwash plains ended up being prairie. That was formerly a prairie area in the western part of McHenry County. So here we have another nice aerial photograph. I only wish I had taken this photograph. There's the glacier, again, looking very dirty along its front because it's lots of dirt coming out of the ice, sediment coming out of the ice. Here you see the moraine, a sort of lumpy form of the moraine. This is one of the most common landforms in the Midwest. And if you haven't stopped complaining about how flat the Midwest is yet, you should stop complaining now, because most of it has a very beautiful rolling form. And I never noticed that until I took a geology class and learned about glaciers. And then I certainly opened my eyes to see that there was this gently rolling nature to the landscapes of the Midwest. It was really, you don't see that anywhere else in the world, not organized like that, because this is a very disorganized rolling pattern. There's no, you can see how the water is ponding up. There's no drainage organization to this gently rolling pattern because it's depositional. The stuff is coming out of the ice a little bit more in one place than another. And we have this sort of gently rolling pattern. Again, one of the most common landscapes of the Midwest. Now these are wetlands and uplands. That might be a hill prairie now or a white oak woodland. This moraine is striated. It's pretty unusual. I've never actually seen one in person. I'm not sure how long those striations actually last when they're weathered. You see on this side, you don't see those same striations. But let's ignore those for a while. Here you can see the outwash plain, water issuing from the melting glacier, forming braided streams. What is this form here? It's a big fan of materials. Well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine that this glacier here was once, the front of the glacier was right here. And that this, in fact, was a channel under the ice. This is an esker. This was a stream channel under the ice. It is depositional. Here it becomes more erosional. We might even call this a tunnel valley form here, becoming an esker form here. But as the water comes out from under the ice, it's not confined anymore, and it spreads out and forms this huge delta, this huge sand and gravel delta. I think the black spots are actually vegetation growing on there, but since I didn't take the picture, I'm not quite sure what that is. And so this would be a delta came formed around the margins of an ice sheet. A came is a body of sand and gravel deposited against the ice. I mentioned in that opening sequence, walking up a steep ice contact slope. Well, there is a steep ice contact slope, meaning that it was deposited in contact with the ice and then slumps later on as the ice melts away. It's fairly, and gravel holds a steeper slope. Things like clays that are dominant in most glacial tills, not all of them, most glacial tills in the Midwest have a lot of clay and silt in them, and that slumps to a much lower angle. So as you drive across the Midwest and you see changes in the steepness of the rolling landscape, you're often looking at a change in the particle size of the tills that were deposited on that moraine. So I think we've done the moraine, we've done the outwash plain, the cames and the eskers. So the eskers and the cames are both ice contact, general term. This is deposited in contact with the ice, which allows it that peculiar, how can a stream make a ridge? No stream today makes a ridge, but a stream with ice on both sides can deposit gravel, and then as the ice melts away, it leaves a ridge.
Kettles and cames often occur together. Here's a kettle occupied by a marsh today, and right next to it, the smooth rounded forms of a glacial came, really a body of gravel deposited in cavities in the ice and then slump into this form as the ice melts away.
Cames and kettles often occur together because they're both ice contact glacial features, meaning they're created as stagnant ice is sitting around, whether it's big hunks of ice like the hunk of ice that's melting below the surface here and the soil is collapsing, or whether it's sediment deposited against the ice, which then slumps away into a hill or a ridge later on, what we would refer to as a came today.
Kettle Marsh in Glacial Park occupies a large glacial kettle, and immediately to north are the ice contact slopes. So these slopes were piles of gravel deposited against the ice block that filled Lost Valley Marsh. And when that ice block melted away, the gravel slumped to this steep sloping form.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about, at a larger scale, how glaciers moved in the Midwest and the pattern of glacial moraines they left behind, and then some of the details of glacial movement in McHenry County. So this is a map of the extent of 4 really major glacial stages in the Midwest. Recognize this is the North American names for them. They have different names in Europe. The Nebraskan being the oldest, and the only remnant we have of the Nebraskan, at least in this part of the Midwest, is this little bit in northeastern Iowa and far southeastern Minnesota. And the next one is the Kansan, which covers much of eastern Iowa. We really don't have either Nebraskan or Kansan in Illinois. What we have a lot of is, not surprisingly, the Illinoisan, named because of its importance in Illinois. And you see that glaciers never reached this area here in southwestern Wisconsin and in far southern Illinois. We call both of these driftless areas, a word that's more commonly used for this area in the southwestern Wisconsin and far northwestern Illinois. And you can see that it wasn't that the glacier ever surrounded this area. It came at it from a variety of sides at different times in glacial history, but that area is a slightly higher elevation, and the glacier has just never overtopped it and left it behind. Now, that doesn't mean when you go to the driftless area that it's really like it was before a glacier. It really isn't, because the Mississippi River eroded hundreds of feet downward during the glacial age, which then energized all of the streams that drain into the Mississippi River, which then eroded down into the landscape surrounding the Mississippi River and dramatically changed the surface topography of the driftless area after the Ice Age. But as far as we know, no glaciers actually covered that. So we're going to look now really at this Wisconsin, but let's just get a quick look at these glacial ages here. So when we're looking at the Wisconsin, we're looking at something, I think they've moved these dates back a little bit now, probably to closer to 30,000 years for the Wisconsin, but, or excuse me, with some of the deposition we have in our area goes back probably closer to 30,000 years. So this is that Wisconsin. This is most of the Chicago area was affected by this, but in far western McHenry County, we do see a representative of the Illinoisan glaciation, and we'll see that in a map picture just a little bit later on. So that's material that's more than 125 to 300,000 years old, much older glacial material. So this is a map, a tiny bit dated. This is Willman's map, 1970, Geology of the Chicago area. Still a useful thing to read, even though they've updated some of the dates and some of the names for geologic features. The general pattern of glacial movement and the general glacial geography of the Chicago area are still very nicely explained by Willman. An even better explanation, more colorful, vivid language, was Harlan Brett's back in the 1930s with this Geology of the Chicago region in 2 volumes. I'm lucky enough to have a couple of those or copies of those in our library with the Conservation District. If you ever go to the library and find those, it's a great read. Harlan Bretz was an engaging writer. By the late 20th century, scientists had realized they were supposed to write in a very boring way in order to sound scientific, but Harlan Bretz was a little bit before that. So here we'll look at this map and see just the major glacial landforms in the Chicago region. Now the glacier really advances into the Chicago area down the Michigan Basin. It expands down and it expands from east to west when the glaciers are expanding and is retreating. Again, it's only the glacial front that retreats, not the ice. It retreats from west to east. And so the oldest moraines are in the west and the younger moraines are in the east. This broad expanse that really rings the entire southern part of the Lake Michigan Basin is called the Valparaiso Moraine. Geologists have broken it up into many minor moraines and are constantly revising and reinterpreting those subdivisions. But this is dated somewhere around 14 or 15,000 years ago. I think those dates are still pretty good. But we have a problem here. You see, we've got this, imagine the Lake Michigan basin is full of ice, so water can't flow northward into Lake Huron and then out the St. Lawrence Seaway. And yet there's masses of water coming off of the ice into the Michigan basin, and it's ringed just like the rim of a bathtub all the way around. The southern part of the basin is rimmed with this Valparaiso moraine. Where does the water go? Well, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper until finally it overtops the moraine, and it does it right here. That's the reason why that glacial lake is called Lake Chicago. It's not because Chicago is an important city. It's because this outlet that controlled the elevation of Lake Chicago was at Chicago. And here you see, once it overtopped the moraine, it eroded all the way through the glacial material down into the dolomite bedrock. That's this purple color here is the exposed dolomite bedrock. So hundreds of feet down into the bedrock, tearing that bedrock and then throwing it along the edges of the Des Plaines Valley. By the time you get into Will County, around where the Lockport Prairie is, it's a wonderful prairie to go visit. If you go there and walk around, you'll see these big flagstones of dolomite just littering the surface of the landscape. And that's a result of this flood of water that overtops the Valparaiso moraine and then rapidly cuts through and rips up the dolomite bedrock and throws it downstream into the terraces along the Des Plaines River. There's the lake plain of Glacial Lake Chicago. When you drive a ride, I used to ride I think it was called the Northwestern train from the western suburbs in, and when you're going over this glacial moraine, you keep looking out the train windows, you notice that the roads bob up and down and up and down, and as soon as you hit the glacial lake plain, they're just dead flat. Once you study geology, all these things become fun and interesting. And this is Glacial Lake Wauponsee, which is a striking feature as you go south on I-50, southwest on I-55, and you're going through Bolingbrook. That's Bolingbrook, and you get to Weber Road. Now remember this, write this down. You get to Weber Road. I think it's and then you'll suddenly go down slope where you're driving off the down into Glacial Lake Wauponsee at that point. I think, and since I know that, I think every time I visit my friends in Central Illinois, going both ways, I think about that boundary of Glacial Lake Wauponsee. This was a very short-lived lake. It was fed as the glaciers were retreating from the Valparaiso moraine, releasing massive amounts of water. Same thing was happening in the Lake Erie Basin. And that so much water was released, it broke a glacial dam at Fort Wayne, Indiana, and flooded across northern Indiana and partly in what's now the Kishwaukee River Valley into the Chicago area. And so it had all of these streams coming together here, and it pumped so much water into this area that it couldn't get out fast enough. It eventually would create what we now know as that deep Illinois river valley that you can visit at Starved Rock State Park. And we'll take just a glimpse at that a little bit later. My Glacial Lake Wauponsee probably didn't last very long, and it was really a broad, shallow lake. There's Starved Rock State Park. This is a fun thing when you go to Starved Rock State Park and stand on top of the rock. You're about 90 feet above the Illinois River. This is about 450 at this point. And if you look around you, it's not evident from this photograph, but if you look around you, you can see that the general level of the land on both sides of the Illinois River Valley is higher than 540. In fact, it's a bit over 600 feet. So that what's called the Kankakee flood is the first major erosional episode that cuts the river down to this top of of Starved Rock. When you're standing at Starved Rock, you're actually standing on the bottom of the river valley at the end of the Kankakee flood. A little bit puzzling initially, but then subsequent drainage of Glacial Lake Chicago erodes the valley further and further down to where the Illinois River is today, leaving Starved Rock as an erosional remnant standing, and several other remnants in that immediate area. Now we're getting down to McHenry County, looking at a little bit more detail at glacial movements and deposition. You remember I mentioned the Illinoisan glacial age, and this is the Illinoisan glacier in several different colors here. This blue color here and this pink color here are both Illinoisan age glacial tills. This is very gently rolling landscape here, and this is somewhat, you can see some stream erosion in here. This is somewhat more hilly, but 125 to 300,000 year old glaciers. By the time you get to the Moraine, you're less than 30,000 years old. So this is the oldest of the Wisconsin age glaciers. The glacier retreats again. We don't know how far it retreats. It comes back, deposits the Woodstock moraine, the Barlina moraine next, retreats from that and advances back to deposit the Woodstock moraine. And the Woodstock moraine actually overrides the Marengo moraine right up here, and where it overrides the two is actually the highest point in McHenry County. It's in one of our conservation district sites. It's called High Point, and the reason it's so high is because it's one moraine depositing material on top of the other. And then we have a recession of the moraine. This isn't actually a morainal boundary, but this is Glacial Park. We're going to look in more detail at this area of McHenry County in just a minute. And we're around 18,000 years ago by the time the glacier gets back to that area. And here we are. So we're around 18 or so thousand years ago. And now we're going to look at just the pattern. This is, I think, interesting because it shows you that the pattern of streams today and former stream valleys and where those come from, and how the drainage system we take for granted today organized itself after the glaciers or as the glaciers were retreating. So here we have the glacier covering much of the northeastern part of the county. The glacial front is right around the town of McHenry. Glacial Park, where I work, is right up here. Richmond, right near the state line, is here. We'll look at Alden Sedge Meadow here in a minute, another conservation district site here in sort of north central McHenry County. And so we have two different subglacial streams flowing here and here. And these are erosional in nature. They're creating a valley. So the forms that they create we call tunnel valleys. And we have actually a side branch here in Glacial Park. And we'll see what all three of these landforms look like here in a minute. Before I go any farther, this is the Fox River, which is obviously under the ice right here, but is now the valley of the Fox River becomes an outwash river valley here. This water is flowing southward through McHenry County and then turns east. And where it turns east, any of you who know McHenry County, if you're a local, you drive south on Route 31 from McHenry to Prairie Grove and Crystal Lake down here, and you come across this huge valley where Route 31 descends. It seems like 100 feet, at least 100 feet down, and then comes back on the other side. And that is where this glacial outwash valley crosses, eroded that huge valley that now Route 31 has to cross. Again, once you know that, I never drive through that valley without thinking of that. And the landscape just comes alive. That's one of the things I love about geology, is the landscape of the Midwest comes alive for me. And every time I'm driving across the Midwest, I'm driving across this thing that happened. It's not just something that's there, it's something that happened. And I'm always asking questions about what happened. Here is that.
This is the former glacial tunnel valley, now occupied by Nippersink Creek. Nippersink Creek is a classic example of an underfit stream, meaning that it's a small stream that occupies a very large valley, and that puzzled people for a long time. What we now know is that ice once formed a roof over this entire valley, and water under high pressure flowed through and cut this huge valley. It's called a glacial tunnel valley.
Hey, Tom, we had a question.
Lost Valley Marsh.
I don't think oh, there we go.
Lost
Go
Valley.
ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, we had someone ask, so the glacier is really moving west to east?
Well, no, the glacier coming out of the Lake Michigan when it's advancing is moving from east to west. The ice is always moving from east to west. The glacial front, when the ice is advancing faster than it's melting, the glacial front is coming out of the Michigan Basin and moving westward across northern Illinois. And as it retreats, in other words, the ice front is melting faster than the ice is advancing, it's retreating from west to east, and the oldest moraines are where it retreats and exposes first, and the younger moraines, step by step, are the ones that are closer and closer to Lake Michigan. Hope that clarified the question. So here we're looking at another tunnel valley, one of the three that I just talked about, or here in McHenry County.
Lost Valley Marsh occupies another glacial tunnel valley. And the reason we know that is the water flowed from left to right in this valley. That's from north to south, away from the glacial center. And to do that, it actually had to flow uphill here, and only water under pressure in a great tunnel in the ice.
That's an important point
done
to
that.
understanding the logic. I mean, how could geologists, they just make this stuff up? But if you look at a tunnel valley and follow it, you see that the former floor of the valley goes up and down and up and not just I mean, any stream does that with ripples and pools, but we're talking about major topographic changes, and water just doesn't flow uphill. And so it has to be under pressure. And so that's what tells geologists this wasn't an outwash feature. It had to be created by water under pressure when the ice covered the area.
Here's another example of a tunnel valley, this one at Alden Gap. Now, gap is a local word geologists use for the landforms left by a tunnel valley. You can see the depression in the middle occupied by a marsh now. We started off looking southwest, and we're turning to look northwest in the direction from where those glacial waters were flowing. Remember, under pressure in a tunnel in the ice.
Actually, I misspoke there. I should have said I started looking this way when this was a tunnel valley. I started looking this way and it was northeast. The water was coming from northeast to southwest. When the ice was out here, this was erosional and creating a valley. Now, the glacier has retreated. It's not under pressure anymore, and it follows a path of least resistance. It finds what is now the course of Nippersink Creek and turns southeast and flows back to this outwash valley, which is still operating. And right now, Nippersink Creek is flowing this way, but here, this is now, again, the tunnel valley. It's becoming an outwash valley that then turns east to join the Fox River. So we have this part of Nippersink Creek has started to flow in its present course. As the ice retreats further, we can see here is Nippersink Creek flowing kind of normal. This is now the path of the north branch of Nippersink Creek, at this point still fed by a meltwater stream coming from under the ice. And this stream, which no longer operates today, is still feeding this whole system coming out from under the ice, all of these joining eventually the Fox River. Here is a close-up of that look of the tunnel valleys in Glacial Park. This is Nippersink Creek. So this is the larger of the two that carried much more water. And this is as the ice retreats, the water is no longer under pressure. The water reverses its flow and is flowing. This is the direction Nippersink Creek flows today. And then it gets to here and it flows west and goes to what's now the chain of lakes in the Fox River. And there the north branch of Nippersink Creek is getting in the act at this point. And that's the present flow of the Nippersink Creek relative to these ancient tunnel valleys and outwash valleys. When you look at the landscape today, you see all these forms, and you have to recognize that forms formed by water may no longer have any water in them at all. So really, you know, it's, for me, geology has been about landscapes coming alive to me. And so a background becomes of interest. It becomes something that's a part of the world that I walk in and look at, and it's always on my mind when I'm out in a landscape and walking around. I can't walk through a forest anymore without walking through and on and inside of this landscape-based ecosystem. And every place has this long history and a story that, for me, has made nature even more interesting than it was before I learned about geology. And it's hard to imagine because nature became fascinating for me in my late 20s. But as I learned about glacial history, it just came alive for me, particularly the Midwest and going around the Midwest. And I always have these questions on my mind when I go to a new place. Always try to get geologic maps and geological narratives out before that so that I can start to understand where it is I'm walking around and what it is I'm seeing. As I said earlier, this landform view, this geological view tells us so much. It tells us about characteristic patterns of soil and plants and animals. So to me, it's not a superficial addition to call this a morainal woodland and not just a forest of white oak, because that morainal definition means that it's a silt loam to silty clay loam, deep soil, relatively impermeable to deep vertical movement of water. So the water moves laterally. It's weathered to an acid profile. That's why white oaks can occupy this site. When it was first deposited, it was very alkaline. White oaks could never have grown there. But the clay-based soils, silt-based soils will weather to an acid profile, which has really created the opportunity for white oaks to grow there. That part of the story is important to me. It really puts that in an important context. It informs me, you know, I frequently hear people talk about de novo restorations and we're starting from scratch, but I really, for me, you're not starting from scratch. The land is still there. And you're all usually working with an intact landform or one that only needs minor repairs, and that predates you. And it was there before you, and it really forms the basis for whatever you're trying to restore. The earth always precedes us, and it's something that is a familiar companion to me through geology. That earth history and geologic history informs me and enriches my experience of landscapes that I walk in, whether I'm teaching about trees or prairie plants or soils. I'm always trying to pull in that geological past because it just makes everything more interesting. Indeed, it has a very long story to tell. And we act on a very, very old landscape. I just pull out Hutton's. In fact, we do know kind of about the beginning today. We don't know about the end, but the idea of the ancient nature of landscapes and how the forms came to existence has done nothing but enrich my point of view and made the world so much more interesting and beautiful to me.
I hope you enjoyed the story. It's a great story. It's a true story, regardless of what you hear. But who would have thought? The Glaciers. I never heard of them before. Out-of-town family, I guess. From New York, maybe. But if they move that rock, I don't want no part of them. I'm not a tough guy. I'm a nice person, just trying to help. I'm always trying to help. But I live somewhere else now. I'm not at liberty to say exactly where that is, but my present employers ask me to move quite frequently. It's a business thing. And my name ain't Francesca no more, it's Jackie Kennedy. I, like the former president, is spelled with a C and an A, Can, Ed, E. But my friends call me Jack. Come from a long line of Jacks. Turns out, the good doctor talked to my former employers, who then had a pressing desire to speak with me about issues I am not at liberty to divulge at this time. So I was moved. I moved to a new place. Where? I cannot say. All I can say is it's in the middle of nowhere, and there ain't no good Italian restaurants within 100 miles. You believe that? Our only neighbors are these little rodents that poke their head out of the ground and look at me. They just look at me. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. But if you'll excuse me now, I need to speak with my present employers once again. I gotta go.
Good morning. Elliot Nest, Inspector, Bureau of Homeland Insecurity, Chicago region. Apparently ice has melted away, leaving no trace of the cause of the most massive border security breach in our nation's history. The identity of ice remains a mystery. At this time, however, our investigations of the rock and ice has revealed no immediate threat to the American public. You should rest easy in your beds tonight, knowing that the Bureau of Homeland Insecurity is on the case. We have now de-escalated the security situation at the border crossings with Canada to code yellow. Thank you. That is all at this time.
Well, thank you. And Claudia, I especially want to thank Jackie, my star actor. Being a little older than Jackie, my technological abilities are not quite so good. So without her, I never could have done any of these, and we were continuing to solve problems even yesterday. So it's yeah, without Jackie, I couldn't have done any of these things. So thank you. But I'm certainly open to any questions you have now. It's a big topic, I know, and maybe a topic that you weren't even ready to ask questions about, but anything that you'd like to ask at this time, I'm ready for it.
Remember, if you want to make a comment, remember to unmute yourself or put something into the chat box. So thank you guys for all the positive messages. It's nice to know you guys are all enjoying our sense of humor here with our little skit. So feel free to start asking questions anytime.
Don't get a big head, Francesca. I mean, you're not going to be a star. You're still going to be working for the Conservation District.
Oh, Tom,
Yes?
don't blow her cover. I just wanted to say thanks. You've answered a lot of questions for me that I'm constantly pestering my husband with while we're driving around. We were just going through Moraine the other day, and I was like, why is it like this? Why is it like that? And now I know. And the thing on 31, I've wondered about that forever. Thank you, Tom. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. It does say chat, so chit chat is acceptable now. We don't, it doesn't have to be high level multi-select.
Got a question in the chat here. Is it easy to tell eskers from moraines in nature around here?
Well, moraines are awfully hard to take a picture of. Now, some of those aerial photographs I showed you were moraines created by mountain glaciers, and the whole scale of activities is far, far smaller than continental glaciers. So moraines are often miles wide. It's hard to get a perspective, particularly when you're standing on the ground where you can see, all you can see is like ground. You see a slope, but you can't really see the form of a moraine. An esker is a much smaller form. A stream the esker would probably be on top of a moraine. That would be a common case. So the esker is deposited under the ice. The ice may be depositing clays and other materials under it, creating the moraine, but the stream is depositing those gravels, which then becomes a snaky ridge on top of the moraine as the ice finally melts away. Again, that's an ice contact landform because the gravels are deposited in an ice walled tube. And then as the ice melts away, it slumps into that sort of a ridge-like form. So you can, it's fairly, an esker, you know, if it's covered in trees and brush, sometimes even those are hard to see. But if you have an esker that's not covered in trees and brush, you can see that snaking form. It's small enough you can see. You can stand on a vaporizer moraine and you can't actually kind of hold it in your eyes at any one point in time because it's so many miles wide.
I had a couple of requests for a van trip, so it's kind of funny because that's originally what this was supposed to be, and then we got the
They do that. That's
order to stay home.
yeah. We had all sorts of plans to do all these things in person, but and we'll get back to in-person stuff. I love taking field trips and taking people around, and in person, your eyes can see things that are so hard for me anyway to capture in a photograph or even a video. You can scan a whole area and you can look back and forth with your eyes in ways. If you try to do that with a camera, everyone would get sick trying to watch it. It's so I'll look forward to that for anyone who can join me on those field trips.
We had a question also about if this is going to be available afterwards. So yes, we are recording the meeting. It will be posted to our YouTube channel at Discover MCCD. And we have a playlist specifically for Tom Talks. So this will probably be a day or two before it's uploaded, but then it will be freely available online after that. We had another question. Stickney Run, I've heard of the Barville Esker or Barville Esker, I still don't know how to say that, which runs parallel to the road, Barville or Barville. So is the ridge further west in Indian Ridge also an esker, or sorry, further east you meant?
I'd have to go there. I'm not familiar with that particular form, so I have to go there to see that. I'm sorry, can't answer that question without going there.
So Tom, the gravel pits that are everywhere in McHenry County, it seems, they're all over the place. So they're really digging into what part of is it a moraine that they're really digging in? And are they ruining that, you know, the rivers that flow below that? I suspect they are, but.
Well, it's a good question. What they're digging is glacial till, which if you were, and again, in the Chicago area, moraines are predominantly composed of glacial till, which is that mixture of clay and silt and rocks of various sizes, very compact, sticky when it's wet, hard as a brick when it's dry. That stuff, everyone wants, you can't build with that stuff. So what people want is the gravel. And so where gravels are being mined, they're mining ice contact landforms or ice contact terraces or terraces along the glacial terraces of the Fox River Valley. So deep deposits of gravel that are left behind from these meltwater streams. That's what they're digging into. Kames are, we've rebuilt 2 came forms in Glacial Park because they were completely mined to the ground, completely gone. I guess, no, 3 of them, no, we've done 4. 3 of them were completely mined away, and a 4th one still had about a third of the cane still there. So kames can be completely obliterated. Likewise, eskers are valuable sources of gravel, relatively rare landform. We only wish that they had left those behind, but sometimes those are completely mined away. So they're looking for those ice contact landforms and terraces of outwash streams when they're mining those gravels.
So I just want to mention it's about noon. So if anybody has to leave, they can. We are going to go through the rest of the questions. So it'll be recorded if you aren't available now, but you want to come back to it later. We had a comment that there's an obvious esker on the southern boundary of the Lake in the Hills Fen conservation area, if anybody wants to see that. We also had a question, are the glacial pattern maps available to the public? And if so, where do you find them?
Well, those most of those glacial maps are fairly easy to find. The one on the one of McHenry County is a little bit harder. As far as I know, that's not online. That's a publication of the Illinois State Geologic Survey. I think it's like Superficial Materials in McHenry County, and so it has a stack of maps that come with that. You can get it from the Illinois State Geologic Survey. Most of those maps are fairly easy to find online in the Midwest. I mean, geology is one of those things. I mean, I wish I could tell you there was a really nice, easy vernacular book telling you about the geologic history of the Midwest. And there is one that comes close. That's Ray Wigger's book of Geology Underfoot. That one is written to the average person and who's interested in sort of roadside geology. There's a roadside, I think, Geology, Wisconsin. There's some of those books. If you start looking on Amazon, you can find them. Geologic. The geologic maps. You can get a number of them from the Illinois State Geologic Survey. Yeah, you don't find them at your average map store, but you can get them from the Illinois State Geologic Survey, or you can find a variety of them online.
Let's see, you got an invite to come see Stickney Run's glacial landforms, which includes several gravel ridges and a distinct kettle next to the one at Indian Ridge. One day we should take a walk. That's from our steward.
Yeah.
We had a couple of nice comments and thank yous from several folks. And another question, is there any way geologists can tell what the landscape looked like before the last ice age?
Well, that's a good question. If you, I can't put the map up, but what they can do with a technique called seismology, or the device is called a seismograph, is they can send shock waves down into the earth and they can tell the thickness of the unconsolidated glacial sediment, the vibrations. I was out with a geologist once doing this, and we were just pounding on the earth with a sledgehammer, hitting a 2x4 on the earth, and that would send shock waves through the earth that would then come back to this machine, and it could tell how thick the unconsolidated sediments were and where the bedrock started. And using those machines, you can determine thickness, and so you can map the bedrock surface. And the bedrock surface shows a curious pattern of stream valleys that are flowing. Our stream valleys today, one thing I didn't point out, I should have, if you look at a map of the Chicago area, familiar things we never notice. And when you look at a map of the Chicago area, what is the direction of the North Branch of the Chicago River, the Des Plaines River, the Fox River, the DuPage River, all of them are flowing north and south. And yet Lake Michigan sits immediately to the east. Wouldn't it make sense that rivers would flow into the lake? And yet, because of the glacial history and that pattern of moraines, north-south orientation of moraines, the water doesn't have any choice but to run north and south until it eventually drains to the Mississippi River through the lower Des Plaines and then Illinois River valleys when it joins the Kankakee. I forgot, what was the initial, I do this all the time. What was the initial question? I get off on my own.
It was, is there any way geologists can tell what the landscape looked like before the last ice age?
So we see that pre-glacial drainage were in fact streams running towards what is now Lake Michigan, but Lake Michigan wasn't there then. It was a river. And the river drained northward. And what we have is a remnant of the river valleys that were flowing into the larger river. And the reason, the fascinating thing about geology, the reason the river was there is because the rocks are softer. It was a Devonian age shale. softer and sort of eroded more easily. It's a natural place where a river would form. The glaciers then follow the path of least resistance, following the river valley, the lowest elevations, following it, sliding into the Midwest. And so they create the basin of Lake Michigan and then Huron and Superior, following those, following the outcrops of the Paleozoic age rocks that were there before. So everything in geology is contingent. When you say geology made the rich farm soils of the Midwest, well, that's true, but it also made the relatively thin, acid, not very productive farm soils of New England, at least many of them. The glaciers can do either. They can erode, they can deposit. In the Midwest, they were eroding soft sedimentary rocks, which ends up creating a fairly nutrient-rich material. So people have some ideas, and they have maps of the former drainage areas. It was probably a hilly landscape, just as you would see maybe in something like, you know, parts of Tennessee or Southern Illinois today, where you have rivers and streams eroding into a dolomite bedrock. A landscape, maybe a little bit like the Driftless area, but again, the Driftless area was affected a lot by post-Pleistocene age erosion. We know something about the preglacial landscape, obviously not as much as we might like or might want to know.
We had another question, comment. Are you familiar with a book by John McPhee, Annals of the Former World, Geology of North America? It's a great book.
Well, it's John McPhee's books, and he wrote a series of them. And I think he started with Basin and Range. I think that was the first one. Wonderful series of books. I haven't read the one that was just mentioned, but I read several of them. It's a good way. Again, I haven't read all of his books, so we may get more into glacial geology later on. He was a hard rock geologist who then became a writer. And the books are fascinating. Again, there are a lot of them on Amazon. I would start with Basin and Range. I think that was the first one, but yeah, what he does is he talks about the people, the geologists who are looking at the landscape. So it has a sort of up close and personal human dimension. Then he talks about the history of the science of people figuring these things out and the arguments and the personalities that were arguing about these things. And then also talks about the landscape. So the combination of those three things makes very fascinating reading.
I had myself muted. There we go. So she added an additional comment that the book she mentioned, the Annals of the Formal World, combines all the various books in John McPhee's series reworked, and his writing makes things very clear. So.
Oh, great. Well, he's an excellent writer.
Mm-hmm.
Well worth your.
All the questions we had in the chat. I know I had one person who had some follow-up questions from our Winter Tree ID webinar. So if there's not any other geology-related questions, we can take that question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I live in Wheaton, but I'm out in Oregon visiting with my son. And after listening to the course and out taking a walk, obviously a question that comes to mind, and I apologize if you touched on this, and I missed in the last call, but are there any native evergreen trees in the Chicago area?
Well, it's a good question. There are. Most evergreens, let's say red pine and white pine, are both native in Northeastern Illinois in certain locations. We have eastern red cedar, northern white cedar, common juniper. So we have a fair. We've also got some Canada yew. I'm probably missing some, but so we have a number of them. But one of the things that happened when broadleaf plants evolved, probably around I think it was around 100 million years ago, flowering plants evolved, is they evolved a capacity for sprouting from the rootstock. So that with most broadleaf plants, if you destroy the upper part of the plant, particularly when it's young, dormant buds around the root collar, and it sprouts back and starts to grow again. Now, there are a few conifers that can do that. As far as I don't have personal experience working with redwood, I'm told that redwood can do it. I know pitch pine can supposedly do it, but most conifers can't do that. So most conifers like white pine and red pine and are not tolerant to the frequent fires that were a part of the Midwest landscape prior to European settlement. We're talking about fires on a frequency of a year to a few years to a decade or so. I mean, these are very frequent fires, and young conifers just can't survive those. They're killed. So where we find the conifers in Illinois are hiding away in the deep bedrock valleys. So go to Star Rock State Park. Go to the Shades and Turkey Run State Parks in Indiana. You can. Those are two beautiful ones. There is there's the one in Joe Davies County. For some reason, the name always, I've gone there so many times. But you go to these Bedrock Canyon State Parks, and you'll see white pine is often one of the most common, along with eastern red cedar, and they're growing along the steep, or originally, prior to European settlement, they were growing along those steep rocky slopes because the fires couldn't get to them. And so they were quite happy there in our climate, but they couldn't survive the frequent fires. Now, the ecology of white pine and red pine by the time you get to the north was kind of a different discussion. We're talking about very frequent fires in a prairie, oak barren, savanna landscape, and conifers just can't really tough that out. The young conifer tree just is killed back to the ground and can't resprout. So they tended to occur in those little fire refugia. They're around, but you don't see them in most places.
Thank you very much.
So in there, I would say I was tying in the geology and the trees. So, good question.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah, Jackie,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Okay, for some reason my chat didn't get sent, but I just want to thank you both. You know, John Prine died the other day, and he once said, to believe in this living is a hard way to go. Thank you very much. You made this way a little less hard rock. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you're able to make it.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Bye-bye.
All
Well, I
right.
don't know how many people we got left now, but I really, really enjoyed this. It's I sort of wish you were here. That's all of my teaching for 30 years has been to people I can see their eyes and see their expressions of puzzlement or boredom or laughter or and I feed off of that. But this is going well. I'm really so happy that so many people join us today, and I want to invite you back next week.
Yes, thank you very much. Next week's webinar will be a step back in time, looking at historical resources and pre-European settlement. That will be 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Friday, April 17th. So with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you for coming.